We'll say a prayer real quick and then we'll get started. Dear God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the many blessings you give us, and we thank you for the freedom and the opportunity we have to come and study your word, to sing praises to you here in a little bit, and to worship you, Lord. And just thank you for the freedom we have to do that. Lord, I ask that you be with us as we go through our classes here and as we go through our worship, and just allow it to bless us and allow it to put something in us to go out and use it to bring others to you, Lord. I just ask you to be with us as we go through this. In Christ, we pray. Amen. All right, so today we are going to be talking about angels. I tried to come up with some nifty little title, and in the end, it was just angels was easy. So I'm going to be honest with you. This one was a little harder. You wouldn't think it would be, but it was actually a little harder doing the research and study on this because of how much mythology is actually out there about angels. So you're having to discern between what's actually in the Bible and what's been written in historical books and context. And then you have some books that are canon, like in the Catholic Church, are considered canon and part of the Bible, that mentions other angels that aren't mentioned in the regular canon of what we have as a Bible. So breaking all that down, and then you have different interpretations of different scriptures. So that makes it, that are in the Bible around angels. So I'm going to cover, for the most part, 10 areas that we know are pretty factual about angels. Again, because the Bible doesn't say a whole lot in detail for a fact about angels. A lot of verses are we bring in different interpretations. We bring in different meanings. We look at some verses and other verses and bring those type of things in. There's some things I learned that we'll look at too here in a second. But this was an interesting study, and I think it's going to just last today. But we'll see how far we get, and if we get all the way through, we'll move on. If not, we'll roll into a second week. So I'm just going to go through different facts and different things that we see. There's a lot of Bible verses in here, so if you're taking notes, I'll try to go a little slower, and I'll also you might want to write a lot of this down. Some areas I put the verse in there so we can look through it. Other ones I just put a list of the verses because we wouldn't have time to read them all. All right, so the very first thing we'll talk about is God created angels. There are some people who believe that angels themselves are actually eternal beings and that weren't created, but that is not fact. God actually did create them, and if we look at that, we can look at Colossians 1, verse 16. It says, "For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him." So that verse, and there's other verses that speak to that, but that verse kind of sums it up pretty clearly, that he created everything that's in the heavens and on the earth. The second thing, they are spiritual beings. Some people think that angels are, or you have the misconception that they are actual physical beings, and that is not true. They are actually are spiritual, and we'll look at a couple of verses around that. In Hebrews 1, 13 and 14, he says, "But to which of the angels has he ever said, 'Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet'? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation?" And then we know, so if you take that verse and then you go to Luke 24, verse 39, this is where Jesus is talking about, "See my hands and my feet, and that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you can see that I have." And this was, a lot of people thought that Jesus, his return, that he was a spirit, and he was showing them that, no, I'm not a spirit, I'm physical flesh, I've actually resurrected. So this is how we know that angels themselves, are spiritual beings. They do not have physical bodies. We're going to talk about that a little bit here in a minute. They can take on that form, but we'll look at that. This was an interesting one I never thought about. They cannot be seen by humans unless God allows them to be or reveals them. So I always, and if you look at most of the verses here, I always thought it was the angel who revealed themselves. But the angel, if you have an angel and they reveal themselves, it's because God allowed you to see that. It's interesting. And if we look at some of the verses, I think I got 3 here. Numbers 22:31. Then the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed all the way to the ground. Then if we look in 2 Kings, verse 6:17, or chapter 6, verse 17. Then Elijah prayed and said, O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And this is another thing that we'll look at, and you'll see a theme of, is sometimes they're referred to as riding chariots of fire, or being in chariots, or having some type of army-like resemblance to them as well. And then in Luke 2, verse 13, and suddenly there appeared with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, I don't have the rest of that verse, but anyways, or the rest of the next verse there. But again, all of these instances where angels are seen and appear before men and are seen, for the most part, it is God who allowed them. God is the one who opened the eyes to allow them to see the angels. All right, and so then the last thing around that, of the creation of angels, they can take on a human form. So they are spiritual beings. They're not made up of flesh and bone, but they can appear to be human. And we'll look at a couple verses around that. If we look in Matthew 28:5, and the angel said to the woman, and here this is where they, do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who has been crucified. And so again, the angel appeared to her, and it appeared, and when you're reading this in the context, as a human being. And then if we look in Hebrews 13:2, they talk about, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it. So the Bible refers here to that, you may entertain someone, or be in the presence of someone, or help someone, and that is actually an angel, and so they take on a human form that know it. I'll give you an example, and I don't know, this is something that happened when we lived in West Virginia. Dad was backing out of our driveway, and if you want to kind of visualize our driveway, it was like this. So, and it was about maybe 50 feet long, going straight down, 50, 75 feet. And he's backing out, and we're backing into a main road, so it'd be kind of like those who live on, I'm trying to think of a road that around here that's busy. I don't know. It's a 2-lane road that was just constantly busy. Had houses up and down it all the time. So he backed out and missed this Dodge Ram. You just didn't see it. So he backs out, and a Dodge Ram slams into the side of him going full speed. I'm up there at the top of the house. I had to move my car for him to get in, or to pull out, because of the way the driveway was. So I'm standing at the top of the our entrance to our house, and all of a sudden I just look around, I turn around, and I see Dad, and I see the backside of his Blazer getting slammed into and just spinning around and flipping over on its side. And so I'm, of course, freak out. I go running down there, and I'm trying to get to where I can pull him out of the vehicle, because it's leaking gasoline and it's just not pretty. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, these 2 guys, large guys, show up. They help us get the door open, pull Dad out of the car, put him down, get him away from it, and then we turn around and they're not there anymore. No clue who they were, no clue where, have no idea. I don't remember any car stopping, I don't remember anything. Just 2 people showing up, helping us get him out of the car, and then they're gone. So I to this day, no one's going to convince me otherwise, I believe that those were angels. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit, because there was no one to stop. There was no one, there was just no one there. And for them to for 2 people their size to show up and do what they did to get him out of a car in time, because that thing was pretty tore up. But anyways, so I believe that. All right, so back to the creation side. We don't know exactly when angels were created. We can confirm, and we'll look at the verse here, that all angels were created by the 6th day of creation. We know that they were obviously created by the 6th day, because he created everything before then. And so in the verse we can go by that is if we look at Exodus 20:11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And if you actually read that verse the way because sometimes it makes you think that he created the seas and then everything that was in the seas. Now, if you actually read this verse, he made the heavens and the earth and the seas and everything that was in all of them, is how that should be read. So basically he's saying there, he created everything in the 6 days and then he rested. The other thing, did someone say something? Okay. The one thing is there's a hint, and we're going to look at this with 2 verses, actually 3 different verses, that they may have been created on the first day of creation. And this is the reason why. So if we look at Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So then that's kind of a blanket statement. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then it talks about the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of water. So we have the first day, the heavens and earth being created. And so when we go and then look in Job, and this was an interesting link. So we have that form, and then Job here, in Job 38, he's kind of talking back to God, kind of trying to instruct and tell God, kind of how things should have been done, I think. And so God responds, and I'm going to read these whole 7 verses. In Job 38, verse 1 through 7, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is it that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? To basically tell him he doesn't know what he's talking about. Now gird up your loins like a man, and I'll ask you, and you instruct me. This had to have been an interesting conversation. So you're telling God, this is kind of a sidetrack. You're basically telling God he doesn't know what he's doing. He's like, okay, man up. You tell me. Let me ask you some questions and you tell me. So anyways, he goes in, he says, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who sets its measurements, since you know, or who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So this last verse here, several times in the Bible, angels are referred to as morning stars or bringers of light, those type of descriptions. So with God talking here, he's talking about the fact of him, of the actual, basically, him measuring out and, putting the measurements and the cornerstones in for the earth. And so if we look at Genesis 1, and we know that, that at the time of when he created the heavens and the earth on the first day, that it was void and formless. And then we see him talking to Job about it, doing the measurements and putting the foundations together, and him talking about the angels and the host of heaven being there with him. So a lot of scholars believe if you take these verses and you put them together, that more than likely when he created the heavens on the first day, that the angels were created along with that. Now, there's nothing 100% that's just scholars taking this and looking at it, but they do believe that that kind of points to that. So you probably could find some things that maybe speak a little bit different, but I think that's of everything I've researched, that's kind of the clearest explanation and the most likely one that we can see there. Yes? Not necessarily, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that.
Or within the first 930 years.
Yeah.
Like 930 years.
Yeah. Well, and I'll talk to that too. I'm going to talk to that a little bit, because I think our misconception in the Bible sometimes, I think, is, there was 6 days, and then there was like a couple days, and then Adam and Eve sinned, right? And so I think we're going to look at the fact that, and there's a debate, and I'm not going to get into that debate. Okay, so say there were 6 days that God created heaven and earth, and then he rested, and then Adam and Eve. We don't know how long Adam and Eve were actually in the garden. And so we'll look at that. We'll look at that here in a little bit.
We don't
1,000 years and 1,000 years is a day. So yeah, and we'll talk about that when we get into a little bit of this, because we are going to look at Satan and him. All right, so there's 3 types of angels mentioned in the Bible. The first one is cherubim, and they're mentioned several times. This one's mentioned the most. They guarded the entrance to the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3:24. God is enthroned above them. In some verses it's translated, and in some areas it looks like they actually hold up or support the throne of God. There's a lot of descriptive language around that some of it could be apocalyptic, others we're not sure, but that they seem to have a role in supporting and holding up the throne of God. God rides on them. In Psalms 18:10, it talks about God riding on them. Now, what that looks like, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. And then there were 2 golden figures of them sitting above the Ark of the Covenant, where God promised to dwell among his people. And that's in Exodus 25:12, and then also in verses 18 and 21. So that was the one type of angel. The second one was the seraphim, I think is how you say that. They were considered the fiery ones. They are described as a 6-winged fiery angel. If you look at the translation, basically was burning one. Basically, their appearance appears as if they are on fire, and they're only mentioned once in the Bible, and that was in Isaiah 6 verses 2 through 7. And one of their main function and role was they continually worship God all the time, saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of the hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." That's going to be interesting to see. A bunch of on-fire angels, man. All right, the third one, and this is, I in my research, I don't know how these fall into the qualifications of angels. I put them in as an angelic type creatures because it doesn't really call them things. But if you look through the Bible, it talks about living creatures or living hosts in the heavens that take on different forms. And if you look, they're mentioned in Ezekiel 1:5 through 14, and in Revelations 4:6 through 8. So what I did is I kind of classified them in the angel category because they're some type of heavenly creatures that God created, so we don't know exactly what they are. But they take on the appearances of lions and ox and man and eagles. We mentioned, and they worship God continually. So they are beings in heaven that worship God. And then the fourth type, I don't know. I wonder, like I said, because you see the descriptive, a lot of this is descriptive language, and a lot of this is writing from viewing an angelic being or a heavenly being from a human standpoint and then trying to put it into descriptive words. And so I think that is what they see is the best way to describe it, is to put it in something that we've seen. Because I don't think it's going to, when we get to heaven, we're going to see things that, as humans, I don't think we could really comprehend. And I think, you look at Revelations and you see a lot of that too, of how they and brought these things out. So I don't think it's an actual lion, but when you see the being, you look at it, it has the closest thing you can relate to it is on earth is a lion type creature. And so, and obviously they can speak and they can worship, so they have that ability. All right, and then the fourth one is fallen angels. These are the followers of Satan, who himself was an angel, and we're going to look at that in a little bit. And there's an interesting, I'd never really read this, and again, some of this stuff is due to interpretation, because a lot of it's in Revelations, a lot of it is in some of our more things that are descriptive languages and stuff like that. But if you look, some scholars believe that the number of angels that fell were 1/3 of the angels in heaven. And where they pull that from is in Revelations 12:3 through 4. It says, "Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 7 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. And his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. So a lot of scholars, and there's different interpretations of Revelations, but a lot of scholars believe that this is referring to Satan's fall from heaven. And him being thrown out, and that when he was thrown out, that he took 1/3 of the stars of heaven, which is sometimes used to refer to angels, with him. So whenever he was cast out and cast to the earth, that 1/3 of the angels in heaven were cast to the earth as well. And so then it goes on to talk about that the woman giving birth, a lot of scholars believe is referring to Christ's birth, Mary giving birth to, and Christ thinking he was going to conquer Jesus when he came to earth. So again, this isn't 100%, this is a descriptive language, but a lot of scholars, in looking through the Old Testament writings, that they believe that is referring to that. No one knows 100% for sure, but kind of an idea. All right. Any questions so far? All right. Only 3 angels are known by name. There's Michael, who's a cherubim, and also an archangel. We're going to look at that. And the verses around that, again, I'm not going to read all these, is Jude 9, Revelations 12, verses 7 and 8, and Daniel 10, verse 13 and 21. There's Gabriel, who was mentioned in Daniel 8:16, Daniel 9:21, Luke 1:19, and also verses 26 and 27. Who is the 3rd angel mentioned in the Bible by name? There's an interesting thing about the name Lucifer. I'm going to talk about that. Satan. He is mentioned 52 times by Satan in the Bible, and then he also has 25 other references that describe him. He's actually the most described angel and talked about angel in the Bible. The term Lucifer, and I'm going to talk about that for a second. So the term Lucifer, anyone know what the term Lucifer actually means? Bringer of light. Do you know how many versions of the different Bible actually mention him by the name Lucifer? For the most part, it's about 1. I think there's some other, offshoots, and that's the King James Version. And the reason that most versions interpret bringer of light, that type of thing. And what happened was when they interpreted the Bible during the King James Version's time, Lucifer was actually a name given to the planet. I think it was Saturn. I cannot remember, but basically it was a term used. So what they did when they were doing that interpretation, they used something that was common in that day, which was the name given for a bright light was Lucifer, and so that's where that name actually came about. That's why you pretty much only see it in the King James Version, and most other versions, your NIVs, your New American Standard, all those other ones, actually refer to him as bringer of light, or I can't remember the other. There's a couple different. Morning Star is another one I believe that they use. So it's interesting when we talk about the devil and Satan that he is described as a bringer of light. And if you actually look, what is God's, or what is, I forget who wrote it, maybe it was Jesus, who said, what do they say about Satan? Well, they say he's an angel of darkness, which is true, but what do they say that he will be for a time? Clothing. In the appearance of, I meant to write it down and I forgot, but the exact, but it talks about for a time he will appear as light, or as good. And so, there's some people who tie those two together when you bring the two, because there's times where Satan will appear as something good for a time in order to fool them. I mean, you look at what he did to Eve in the garden. He came as someone coming to do something good to help you out. To you'll be able to do all these things, and so same thing. All right. My next note here. Go ahead.
did he do away with this angel?
So what was the question? What was that last part?
Why did he do away with that angel? Satan.
So it's interesting. A lot of the descriptive words, and I'm hesitant to go. I'm going to get into it. I will get into it. So there's a lot of things in like Ezekiel and Isaiah that talk about the fall of a man, and it also some scholars. There's a lot of controversy around whether it was actually talking about the king at that time, or whether it was actually talking about the king, then Satan, and then the king again, or whether it was a dual reference. I think it's in Ezekiel 14 and Isaiah 7. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head. I can look them up and we can look at that maybe later on. 28:14, thank you. But it talks about a creature who is so beautiful and so magnificent that they became so prideful that they caused themselves to fall. And a lot of people believe that is talking about Satan there, that Satan basically believed and saw himself and believed his appearance was so great and that he was so great, and that basically the first sin, if we want to talk about it, that when sin truly entered at that time, was pride. Because he thought he was so wonderful because God created him that way. So he felt at that point that I'm so wonderful, then I want to take the glory for God. And we'll look at this in a little bit, but he wanted to take the glory that God, he felt he deserved that. And basically, the way some of the description is there was a battle in heaven. Michael led that, which we're going to look at here in the hierarchy. And they're in that battle. Satan and all of his angels were cast to the earth to basically, or into hell itself. That's part of the reason it was created, was for them, to put them in there, and that Satan and his angels were cast to the earth, and that this is their dominion. They're given rule over a certain type of rule over the earth, and that's what God has done with them until he comes back, when he'll throw everyone who, obviously with all the angels and everything, into hell. So again, when we look at a lot of these different verses and stuff, there's a lot of different meaning that can be brought out with them, and there's a lot of different interpretations from different scholars. But it's interesting that, we look at the fact that angels themselves, God created these beings, these spiritual beings, and gave them themselves free will. And so it's interesting. But angels have a hierarchy. So Michael's a cherubim is called an archangel. The Bible never really says how many archangels there are, how many. We just know, we don't know if there's just one. In some of the references you see about groups of angels, I think there's probably more than one. I think it just calls out Michael by name. He was called one of the chief princes, and that's another one that says one of the. He wasn't called the, one of the. So in Daniel 10:13, and he leads or led God's angelic army in Revelations 12 when it talks about the battle there. All right, this is another one I never really thought of. Angels are not omnipresent, so meaning they can't be in more than one place at one time. Unlike God, who is omnipresent, angels are finite creatures, and we see this in Daniel 10:12 through 14. And he goes, "Then he said to him, 'Do not be afraid, Daniel. From the first day that you set your heart on understanding this and on humbling yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to your words.'" So this is the angel telling him that. He says, "But the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days. Then behold, Michael, one of the chief princesses, came to help me, for I had been left there with the king of Persia." So this angel is in some kind of conflict with the prince of Persia, the kingdom of Persia, and Michael came to help him. "So now I have come to give you an understanding of what will happen to your people in the latter day, for the vision pertains to the days yet future." So, he's describing the fact that, basically saying, I wanted to come sooner, but I got tied up with this guy over here, and so I had to wait. If they were omnipresent like God, they could have been in more than one place at the one time. So he wouldn't have to worry about that. We do not know how many angels exist, but the Bible implies that there are a lot of them. If we look in Deuteronomy 33, verse 2. He said, "The Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. He shone from the Mount Paran, and he came from the midst of 10,000 holy ones at his right hand that were flashing light for them." So in just this one description, we see that there's 10,000. In Psalm 68:17, the chariots of God are myriads, and typically a myriad, when translated a lot of times, is 10,000. So thousands upon thousands, the Lord is among them as at Sinai in holiness. And then if we look in Hebrews 12:22, "But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels." So tens of thousands of angels. And then Revelations 5:11, "Then I looked, and I heard the voice of many angels around the throne, and the living creatures, and the elders. And the number of them was myriads of myriads, and thousands of thousands." So I think, I don't know, the Bible doesn't give a number, but I think the description of myriads and myriads is almost uncountable. So, I mean, there's just lots and lots, and we know that, it talks about, Jesus could have called 10,000 angels just to come down. And so we know there's at least 10,000. The Bible does seem that there is some sort of guardian angel. And we're going to look at this, and we're going to look at some of the things around us. We know that they protect people. All right? If we look in Psalms 91, verses 11 and 12, he says, "For we give his angels charge concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will bear you up in their hands, that you do not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus seems to support the idea that individual people, or at least children, have some sort of guardian angel. In Matthew 18, verse 10, he says, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that the angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven." So it refers to their angels, that the little ones have some sort of angelic protector. The disciples say, they talk about Peter's angel must be knocking on the door. If we look at Acts 12:15, they said to her, "You are out of your mind," but she kept insisting that it was Peter, or that it was so. They kept saying it is his angel. They didn't actually believe it was Peter. They believed it was Peter's angel. So here's the thought around guardian angels. The thought is that they do exist. There's some type of protective angels. The thing we're not 100% sure on, or that most scholars aren't, is whether each individual person has a guardian angel, or if they guard like a select. So the best analogy that we were able to come up with when looking through this was, we're not sure if they play man defense or zone defense. So we don't know if they're assigned to each individual person, or if they cover a certain amount of area. So I thought that was humorous yeah, definitely they play some protective role in humans' lives. All right, angels are very powerful, and I'm not going to go through all these, but they are very powerful. They have might, power, and dominion and authority, and you can see that in Psalms 103, verse 20, Ephesians 1:21, and Colossians 1:16. They are more powerful than humans, obviously. 2 Peter 2:11 and Matthew 28:2. They use their power to battle against Satan's demonic forces. We see that in Daniel 10:13, and Revelations 12:7 and 8, and Revelations 20 and 1 through 3. They carry out God's plan. Yes? I'll tell you what I'll do. If y'all want me to print these slides out, I can do that. I'll do that. That way we can go. If you want to continue to write, I'll print them out, and I'll provide copies next week for anyone who wants them. And they carry out God's plans, bring messages to people. We saw that in Luke, Acts, and a lot in the New Testament, some in the Old Testament. All right, so I'm going to go through these real quick, so don't feel you have to write all these down. Like I said, I'll print out the slides. They carry out some of God's judgments. So some God did himself, some God sent angels to do. Bringing the plague upon Israel in 2 Samuel. Smiting the leaders of Assyrian army in 2 Chronicles. Striking King Herod dead because he did not give glory to God in Acts 12. Pouring out bowels of God's wrath on the earth. We see that in Revelation 16:1. They patrol the earth as God's representatives. We see that in Zechariah chapter 1, 10 through 11. They carry out war against demonic forces. We talked about that one. When Christ returns, angels will come with him as a great army, accompanying their King and Lord. The Bible talks about that in Matthew and Luke and in 2 Thessalonians. So that kind of gives you an idea of their number, that area. When they come back, it's just going to be an awesome presence. When Christ returns, an archangel will proclaim his coming. Talks about the archangel horn, the archangel's call. That's in 1 Thessalonians 4:16. We see that in Revelations and other passages as well. Here's a very important one, and I think this is why there's not a ton of detail about angels in the Bible. They are not to be worshipped. Worship of angels is one of the false doctrines being taught in Colossians 2:18. It says, "Let no one keep defrauding you of your prize by delighting in self-abasement and the worship of the angels, taking a stand on visions he has seen, inflated without cause by his fleshly mind." So we look in Colossians, there was some worshiping of angels going on there. The angels warns John in Revelations 19:10 not to worship him. He says, "Then I fell at his feet to worship him, and he said to me, 'Do not do that. I am a fellow servant of yours and your brethren who hold the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of the prophecy.'" So again, he's warning them not to do that. And we shouldn't pray to angels either. We should only pray, and if we look at that, to Jesus or God. We see that in 1 Timothy 2:5. "For there is one God and one mediator also between God and men, the man Christ Jesus." So we're not to pray to them either. So I wanted to talk for a second about, I thought I had it in my notes here and I didn't, I apologize, about the fall of Lucifer. We talked about it a little bit. And so that's the thing that we've got to realize, that Satan himself was in fact an angel at one time. And most people, I think, realize that. There's a lot of debate on whether, some people believe he was an archangel. Some people believe he was a cherubim. Some people believe he was both. And other people believe at first that he was actually the leader or the most powerful angel in heaven. There's some stuff around that. There's some things you can interpret that way. There's some historical, non-canon biblical stuff that talks about that, but there's nothing for sure that really says that 100%. So a lot of that is mythology that is brought in. But what we do know from the Bible, like we talked about a little bit earlier, is he did bring himself up to be, he felt that he should be on the same level, if not as not powerful or more powerful than God himself. And so he basically mutinied against heaven and was thrown out, like we talked about earlier. Him and his angels were thrown out. Now, the time frame that this happened, obviously it didn't happen in the first 6 days, right, of creation. So you have your first 60 days of creation, then God rests. And so then you have the time frame from that when he rested, where Adam and Eve are in the garden, and till the fall. We really do not know how long of a time frame that was. It could have been 10 million years. It could have been 1,000 years. It could have been 3 weeks. We don't know. And there's some references around, well, if it had been 10 million years, when we see all this, then the age of the earth and all this other stuff. And there's a lot of things that we don't know about that happened when sin actually entered the world. You know, if we look at the way the Garden of Eden was, there was no death, there was no rotting, everything was perfect, everything was it was paradise on earth, it was heaven. So the thought is that most things in the earth were eternal at that time. So that, like, things in heaven are eternal, and eternal when I meaning they last forever once God created them. They felt that the earth was sin, and then when sin entered the earth, a lot of that changed. Again, this is a lot of theory. So it could have been that the angels in heaven were there for a very, very long period of time before all this happened and the fall happened. But there's no timetable really given to that. So the thought is that obviously it happened after the creation, after the rest, and before Eve's fall, because once he was thrown down to earth, that's when the temptations are. Now, how all that went, because you have obviously, if sin couldn't have entered the world into that time, but you have the tree. Why would he put the tree there if the devil hadn't fell yet? There's a whole lot of, but I don't think we're meant to, I don't think that's important, and I don't think it's something that we have to know, right? We do know that sin entered the world, and it entered the world through Satan. And so that was kind of when I was going through that, it was hard for me to decide whether to really go in, because it can become a pretty deep rabbit hole. and because there's some interesting non-canonical books out there that were found with the Dead Sea Scrolls, that were found with a lot of things that talk about, like, for example, who in here, and this was a surprise to me, who in here has heard of the Archangel Raphael? Okay. I thought at one time there was our Archangel Raphael. Well, in the Bible that we have, it's not actually, he's never mentioned. But he is mentioned in some books that were found with, I think it's the book of Enoch, that was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, I believe the Catholic Church has brought some of those in as canon, where other different people who were determining the Bible decided that they could not find enough evidence for them to be canon. So there's a lot of things in there that talk about angels, and that's where a lot of the mythology comes from, and a lot of these different things. And then also some things come in from other religions or actually I'll say come in, they went out and then kind of came back in around angels and the devil and demons. And it actually lists, a lot of the books actually list, I think there was like 9 or 10 different angels that are mentioned by names in some of these other books. And so it can get, like I said, you start diving down into it, it can become a really deep rabbit hole that you almost can't pull yourself out of, especially if you're someone like, I love science fiction and anything that's kind of a science fiction type background. So researching this was fun, but I'd had to stop sometimes because I would find myself going way down this trail, and I'd have it in my notes here, and then I'd be like, I really can't talk about this. And so I'd come back all the way back up, and there's a reason for this. I think this is important, but I think that last point, yes, angels are there. They play an important role. They've played a very huge role in announcing the birth of Christ. They're going to announce his coming back, those type of things. But again, I think there's a limited amount of information on them on purpose, and that is the fact that we don't become too obsessed with them, right? I think there are cultures and there's people who've become so obsessed with them that they've actually started to worship them or put them on a level of God. And that's not where they're, like the one angel talks about. They are a servant of God just like we are, on the same level, and we're not to worship them. So it's an interesting study, and I'll be honest with you, this kind of stuff, Revelations, Daniel, all this kind of, what I call the sci-fi chapters of the Bible, they interest me, and I love researching that stuff. But I think sometimes if we get too focused on that kind of stuff, it takes away from the real purpose and the real meaning. So, any questions, comments? Well, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, right. Go ahead.
It says, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made heaven and earth. And so from there, verse 4, that's verse 4, then it goes back and gives a recap of all that was done in the first chapter.
Yeah.
And if you leave verse 4 out, then you think all this is still happening after he rested.
Yeah.
But it was before.
Yes. Yeah. So, and that's a good point because there's some people who will interpret that way. So, all right, well, I hope y'all enjoyed this. I know it's kind of a lot of information. Like I said, I'll print the slides out. Next week, we're going to start into a series. I haven't named it yet. I'm trying to come up with a name I feel fits. But it's going to be taking everything that we have been looking at for about the last year or so and kind of wrapping it up into a nice, pretty bow. Maybe not a pretty bow, but and pushing forward on that. So I hope y'all enjoy that. Thank you.